Ganesh, what percentage of alternative data sets, in your view, really deliver alpha?
It's a great question. Before I give you my answer, I will say that we are very bullish on alternative data. We definitely think that alternative data is going to be one of the key drivers of asset management and can really help funds on multiple dimensions. So obviously adding alpha, but also adding diversification to strategies, adding capacity to strategies potentially, and to be perfectly blunt, adding marketing to strategies so you can attract and retain capital. That's important. Yeah. So we think it's really important, but we think it's really hard. And we've looked at over 100 different data sets in the last 4 or 5 years and really analyzed them very in depth with sophisticated quantitative techniques. And most of the time we just don't find anything. So I would say that roughly 10% of the data sets we've looked at have true provable investment value, at least the way we've looked at it. Now, obviously we could be missing something in many cases, but that's what we found.
For quantitative strategies.
For quantitative strategies specifically. Yep, that's right. And that's an important distinction because a lot of the data sets that might not be useful for quantitative strategies, they might not have the breadth, for example, they might cover a particular sector and they're not going to be as useful. So that'll reduce your coverage quite a bit. But we really think that that most data sets might be redundant with one another. They might not have, the data might not be as clean. There are a lot of issues with practicality of the data sets. That's not to say that a data set either has value or it doesn't. A lot of it's about how it's used and how applicable it is to a fund manager's process. And those funds which have a well-established process for evaluating those data sets are more likely to find that value. Now, the other issue is that a lot of these alternative data providers might not have the background in funds management. They may not have actually sat in the seats of their clients and figured out what these issues are that make these data sets less valuable. So I'll give you some examples. We've seen a lot of data sets where the provider might show some great research results that are entirely driven by microcap stocks that most asset managers can't really trade. They might not have taken into account transaction costs, and a signal or an alpha generated from this alternative data set might not overcome transaction costs, might be too fast moving. That doesn't mean it's useless, by the way. It might mean that it has to be combined with other things to be useful. From a practical perspective, the data needs to be clean, needs to be tagged to identifiers. Tickers aren't great, they get reused, and so on. So QSIPs or CDALs, other identifiers are important. Survivorship bias. So does the historical data contain defunct companies? This is something that a lot of data providers might not think about, but they need to have that data if they're going to provide it to at least a quantitative manager.
It's a tough thing to solve, right?
It's sure, backfilling data is difficult, right? If you're starting today, you don't know what was around 5 years ago. And restatements of history. So this is something that can affect even the big data providers. And there's a large data provider who was providing restated history to their clients for years. And there's academic work on this that's, it's obviously unfortunate, but you have sort of an obligation to provide your history in a point in time way as presented as was, and warts and all. So these are practical considerations that might not be obvious to some providers, but these are key considerations, and they mean that many of the data sets might hold a lot of promise theoretically, and there might be intuition, which is really important around whether they can work or not, but it's very hard to overcome if the data isn't of sufficient quality.
If you're a vendor, how would you advise to solve the mapping problem? If you were starting out, right? If you were starting out a new credit card data set for Asia, for China, how would you think about mapping that?
It's difficult. I mean, oftentimes you're starting with a data set that has no mapping at all. So it might have company names, it might have no tickers even, nothing. It's often a manual process. We have one data set where the mapping is not even from the company level, it's from the product level. So products and services and brand names. And that is honestly a manual process of mapping those things and updating it over time and keeping it updated going forward. In many cases there is no substitute for a manual process in something like that. But certainly, there are databases that you can bring to bear on mapping identifiers like tickers, QSIPs, and so on. We actually have built an engine for mapping company names. So we have data sets which come in a very raw form, and it's just a company name, and you have no way of knowing automatically whether that maps to a particular ticker or a QSIP or whatever, and we've built a fuzzy matching algorithm to actually handle that problem. So that's actually a very difficult programming issue as well. So,
How are the most forward-looking firms thinking about this 10% problem? We've heard that the range of conversion from licenses to, from trials to licenses is typically 5 to 15% in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned 10%, which is in the middle there.
Mm-hmm.
How are firms thinking about that and trying to improve, I guess, that conversion metric?
Sure. Yeah, this is a really important thing right now because there's such an abundance of data sets, as you know. I mean, there are hundreds, if not thousands, and it is just difficult to call through them all and find out which ones have value. So that process needs to be well established. It needs to be structured. We see some funds who are fairly haphazard about it. They find an interesting data set, they get excited about it, they test it out, and that can work. Sometimes you get lucky. But having an actual process in place where there's someone who is in charge of this and whose job it is to sort of walk through the process of evaluation, everything from vendor contacts to understanding the completeness of the data set to really analyzing this and having a proper database of it, analyzing the quality of the data set, the predictability of it. And that's not an automatable process entirely. There are parts of that that will require creativity. You come up with a new data set, you need to sort of analyze it in ways you might not have thought about before because you've never seen a data set like this before. So we think that there's, you can't fully, turn a robot on this problem, but you can automate parts of it, and you can certainly have a structure around it where people are assigned parts of this process, and people who have domain expertise and data expertise. We think that's really important. The funds who are most forward-looking on this are not necessarily the largest ones. Some of them are, at least in the quantitative space, but they're the ones who have thought hard about the problem and have assigned a process to the problem. And I think that's really important.
What are some of the issues that old data providers or vendors may not realize are important to the buy side?
Yep, so I think some of it is what I mentioned before, sort of the issues with coverage and survivorship bias, practicality of the usability of the data, how robustly the data is delivered on an ongoing basis. I mean, at the end of the day, ultimately you need the data to show up before you can even use it at all. So that's sort of key. It's that, but it's also just the ability or the willingness to be very forthright about what your data is, what it is not, and to the extent that you can know this, what it's good for. Now, not all data vendors might necessarily have the expertise within the capital market space, but to the extent that you've seen how people have successfully used your data set in the past, that can provide some guidance and can help people get farther along in that process.